Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Arcanists, specifically how they exist and why, right? Which are both very pertinent questions, especially when we consider that we all already know that humans are clearly the superior species. The game often refers to Arcanists as a species distinct from humans, which, to a degree is true. However, I don't believe that this is completely accurate. Rather, I don't believe that Arcanists are necessarily a monolithic species, right? Instead, I think it is more a term to describe a general collection of entities that share some very specific traits. And on its own, that would be fine, right? If magic were just this ethereal, unexplainable thing, then it's not a problem. All of these distinct entities have magic because abracadabra, who cares, right? But it's not that simple. You see, in this world, magic is very much a biological thing, at least to a degree. There is an arcanum gene. It is something that can be empirically observed within the bodies of Arcanists. The story goes to great lengths to stress the impact that blood purity has on arcane output. So it is something that can, very realistically be quantified. It is biological, and because it is biological, it brings up some questions. But before we get to that, let's just go ahead and qualify what exactly falls under the designation of Arcanist. In the broadest, most general terms, an Arcanist is simply an entity which has the potential to utilize Arcanum, though there are two things to note regarding this. First, while they may have the genetic potential to utilize Arcanum, that does not necessarily mean that they are actually physically capable of doing so, right? Pre-transformation Semmelweis is a notable example of this, as despite her arcane lineage, she is basically incapable of any magic on her own, leading her to rely on human-made Arcanum in order to operate. Secondly, not all entities capable of utilizing Arcanum are necessarily Arcanists, right? Critters, Awakens, some of the Beyond, all of them are capable of at least some degree of arcane ability, and where exactly we're drawing this line is still kind of unclear, right? There are some things that feel like they should fall into Awakened within the Arcanist category. There are some that feel like they should fall more into Critters. Who knows, right? In terms of their difference from their mundane counterparts, Arcanists are typically considered to be less rational and more prone to being swayed by things like emotion and spontaneity than logic or reasoning, at least according to Foundation Doctrine, which may not be the most comprehensive resource, honestly, maybe not the most unbiased thing in the world, right? Now, in terms of what kind of Arcanist we have, they can roughly be divided into four main categories. The most obvious and the most prolific, at least within our suitcase, are those who are fully humanoid. They are basically just humans with the addendum of magic, right? Appearance-wise, they are basically indistinguishable, although the game notes regarding the presence of the arcane gene may imply that they are technically a separate species. Next are the former humanoids, and this includes our ghosts, who honestly I'm still a little bit unsure of, right? They may just be Arcanists who are now deceased and have come back, or their previous status as human or Arcanist is irrelevant, and it's only their current status as a ghost that just naturally grants them this arcane ability. They are Arcanists because they are ghosts, sort of thing. Within this category, we also have Rabies and Nick Bottom, who had both been humanoid at one point, but circumstances have sort of led them to their current appearance. I think Rabies may have met a Beyond at some point. I think that's what his story's implying, at least, but who knows. After that, we have just non-humans, right? Species that are entirely distinct from humanity, but are nonetheless classified as Arcanists. We have bird people, Rusalka, dogs, elfin, banshee. All of these fall within this category. And this is our primary indicator that Arcanist is more a designation of a group of entities as opposed to its own standalone species. And finally, after all of that, we have the non-organics, entities that don't quite conform to the traditional, scientific definition of life, and also the reason why I keep referring to them as entities instead of people. Darley Clatter, Door, and TTT all fall here. The main takeaway with this category is that Arcanism is not only constrained to blood or biology, it can arise in other ways, right? It can be granted even. So that's Arcanists. We are mainly going to be focusing on our organics, as that is where the topic of blood and genetics is actually pertinent. And this leads us to our primary question, right? Which is how exactly magic as a, biological mechanic arose in individual species. Because normally you just say evolution, right? And be done with it. But the thing is, evolution doesn't really cover it. The thing about evolution is that traits don't generally develop just because. There's typically a reason they develop, right? A species doesn't just say, I would like to have a sick-ass shell, and then a couple generations later develop a sick-ass shell. That's not how it works. Environmental pressures drive a species to develop in certain ways. If your predator species typically relies on claws or teeth to hunt you, then the members of your kind would say tougher hides will generally be more successful, right? They will live long enough to procreate, and that thick hide trait propagates through the species with each successive generation, and then maybe after a couple thousand years, then you get your sick-ass shell, right? Very basic evolutionary theory. Well, in that case, what sort of evolutionary pressures would lead to, say, a creature developing magic? It's a bit hard to determine, right? Not unfeasible, but it requires imagination. But that's not where the problem lies. See, it's one thing if it's just humans and humanoid arcanists. We could claim that one is derivative of the other, or they both branched off of a common ancestor, and it'd be fine. It would at least make some sense. But then we have the non-humans. More specifically, we have a dog. And not just any dog, a border collie, a breed that is extant and has a mundane counterpart, right? Meaning that this could be a very, very extreme and a very, very specific case of convergent evolution, multiple distinct species developing similar features over time. This could mean that this magic gene developed concurrently within at least two completely separate species while still retaining most of their, physiological features, right? They still look like a dog, they still look like a human, they just have magic. And I mean, that's just what we know of, right? Maybe there's more. Maybe there are magical quokkas out there or something, who knows? In any case, what sort of environmental pressures would require that much specificity in not just one, but two species developments, while also not, demanding any other physical changes from them? I think it's a little bit too extreme to be a natural occurrence. So, I mean, what's going on? Well, the simplest answer here is that it wasn't really thought through, and we're just supposed to hand wave it away for the sake of convenience. So that is exactly what we're going to do. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you all on the next one. All right, bye-bye. Now, right, what this could mean is one of two things. First, Arcana may be the baseline of most of our higher order life within this world, which, over the course of a couple thousand years, speciated out into magical and non-magical variants. That if you were to trace even the most mundane individual's lineage far back enough, you'd eventually find an arcane ancestor, right? However, I don't really think that's the case, at least not fully. Partially because the first circle story told to us by Arcana and 6 in Chapter 7 seems to imply the opposite, that humans and Arcanists developed concurrently and just chose different paths. And also because we actually have some evidence towards the other theory. And that is that Arcanum is something that was at one point imbued into mundane species, whether that be through, procreation or some other means. Now, we know for a fact that Arcanists can procreate with beings that don't necessarily fall under the umbrella of humanity, right? Vila exists. And I think it's very possible that most Arcanist lineages, if not all of them, were derived from some intermingling with critters or some other manner of arcane beast far, far back in the past, far enough that through repeated procreation within their own species, they have regained a mostly human appearance, right? For example, while the terms Rusalka and mermaid are used interchangeably within the story, Rusalka as we know them are technically not actually synonymous with true mermaids, right? True mermaids, primitive mermaids as the game puts it, are something else entirely. Rusalka are the progeny of these mermaids and some other species, retaining many of the fish-like features of their ancestors. And although their mermaid ancestry is noted to be above at least 50% of their genetic makeup, they are still technically labeled as pureblood by Utu's metric. Genetically, however, they are a mixed species, right? The Rusalki that we fight in the insight stages are prime examples of this. Samadiva, who we meet briefly in Vila's side story, may also be one of these, or he may be a true mermaid. It's a little bit uncertain. The descriptions that were given are kind of ambiguous, so it could go either way. However, it is noted that true mermaids are pretty much all gone now, so he's probably a Rusalka, which is also probably why Rusalka are just labeled pureblood in general now. There is no longer anything else to compare them to, right? Meanwhile, Hybrid Rusalka are individuals whose mermaid ancestry accounts for less than 50% of their genetic makeup, right? These tend to look far more human with minor Piscean traits like scales, as we see in Vila. And I mean, Vila is just one generation separated from her Rusalka brethren, right? And she can already mostly pass as human. After several more generations, we could probably expect to see individuals who are basically indistinguishable, while also still retaining some modicum of the mermaid arcane abilities, although, dilute. And potentially that's how all Arcanists as we know them came to be. I do wonder how that first generation of Rusalka happened, though, because according to the description that we get, true mermaids look less like humans with fishtails and more like something that crawled out of fucking Innsmouth, right? I mean, just look at what a pure blood Rusalka looks like. I guarantee anything further back in that lineage isn't going to be any prettier. I mean, to each his own, but goddamn, man. On another note, Spathadia mentions the possibility of her family being part of the Red Dragon's lineage, and while this is later proven to be false, it implies one, that dragons exist, and also that they have potentially the same capability to sire offspring with Arcanists. Additionally, Junyangzi, the horse enthusiast, is classed as mixed, not Arcanist, which means that while her mother had been a Lushu, her father had been human. This shows both that arcane creatures are capable of interbreeding with mundanes, as well as that the classification system only really takes immediate parentage into account, almost entirely, disregarding scale of ability, as Ju's arcane skill vastly overshadows many of our true Arcanists, right? For Arcanists with more dilute blood, this means that their intermingling with the mundane occurred further back in the lineage. Both of their parents, at least, would have been considered Arcanists. It is also potentially how Pickles came to be, as we don't have any indication that arcane creatures' capacity for interbreeding is limited to only humanoids, right? Perhaps at some point in antiquity, some manner of arcane creature did the dirty with a dog, and several generations later we end up with a border collie who's able to use domain expansion. I don't actually know what his arcane skill does. His bio lists his medium and afflatus as philosophy, which tells us pretty much nothing about what it actually is. But that's the reproductive side of it. However, I don't think that's the only way to introduce Arcanum into a bloodline. You see, in A Series of Dusts, we meet Valentina, a Beyond, right? More specifically, a vampire. And when she infects Semmelweis with the Beyond disease, Semmelweis begins to experience changes, typically in the form of ailing physical health as well as auditory and visual hallucinations. We then later learn that this is not a disease and more of a transition, a transformation from her current self to something that is closer to what Valentina is, a vampire. You see, the way Valentina describes it is retroactively editing Semmelweis's bloodline, right? Rather than simply granting her Arcanum, the infected transition is basically changing Semmelweis's entire genetic makeup to match Valentina's. And then we later see that Semmelweis is actually now able to use Valentina's arcane ability. The interesting thing is that the hallucinations that Semmelweis had been experiencing after being bitten were actually the resurgence of another personality within her, the so-called primal shadow of Semmelweis that calls herself Bella, awakened by, this infection. And while at first the assumption is that Bella is, Semmelweis's nascent vampiric instincts taking hold, this is soon refuted. If anything, Bella is acting in direct opposition to the vampiric impulse. She notes that as the transition progresses, she finds that it is attempting to sort of tear her out, right? Basically replace her. Which I think is a very interesting parallel to the actual, physical process of shifting Semmelweis's bloodline. We know that every Arcanist that succumbs to the Beyond disease experiences similar hallucinations. However, now we know it is also not a disease, right? We know that these are not actually hallucinations, but instead another psyche emerging. And this second psyche could just be something that is, intrinsic to all Arcanists, but under normal conditions is repressed, right? Something like, say, their arcane heritage. In that case, we can potentially think of Bella as an echo of Semmelweis's bloodline progenitor, right? The thing that granted her bloodline an arcanum however long ago. But now that that bloodline is being shifted, Bella is being supplanted by the new progenitor, Valentina, right? And this is kind of reflected in Semmelweis's Udimo. While it could just be a winged cat, technically a panther, we know what winged cats look like in this game, and it's not that. right? It's possible that Semmelweis's Yudimo was originally just a regular panther, but the shift in her blood has affected it, causing it to gain vampiric traits, right? In a sense, Valentina has created a new arcane bloodline. And in more general terms, this could just be how arcane species rose to begin with, right? Something, whether it was, a beyond or an arcane beast, imbued a mundane creature with arcanum in some way, and then this was later passed down through generation after generation. Now, as a bit of a minor side note, we also have a third possibility via TTT's existence, and that is that arcanum can just spontaneously arise in anything, really. And while that may be the case, personally, I think TTT falls closer to what we would consider an awakened. She definitely ticks off all of the awakened prerequisites, so why she's classed as an Arcanist remains a bit unclear to me. But just know that random chance is very much a possibility in just developing Arcanum for no reason, right? On a final note, I'd like to talk about the Yudimo, the little creature thing that shows up in the suitcase when an Arcanist isn't in play. I think that this Yudimo could be sort of an indicator of what that Arcanist's original progenitor could have been. Now, the word Yudimo itself pulls up absolutely nothing besides just reverse 1999 when you try to research it. It is wildly frustrating. From what I can gather, there are two potential origins for the word. The first is eudaimon, which in the original Greek denotes a good spirit or entity, kind of like a protector figure. The second in Esperanto, which is the language that Arcana uses, as well as the immunity ritual and the suitcase incantation, Udimo is an invocation of the divine. It is calling out to God. It is epiclesis, invoking the Holy Spirit. And I would just like to thank Mask for pointing this out during a stream. I wouldn't have thought to look into it otherwise. In the case of the suitcase Udimo, rather than a good protector entity or calling out to a Holy Spirit, it could instead be an invocation of the Arcanist's progenitor. It is showing, in a sense, their most primitive essence. And I think that's why, with some exceptions, Arcanists are the only characters who actually have a wholly different entity as their Yudimo form, right? Awakened and humans are just themselves, but smaller. Infected are basically, Arcanists anyways, but they've been touched by the Beyond, and the Beyond themselves generally don't even have a set form to begin with, save for Alien T, who also just shows up as himself. Arcanists, the only units that are guaranteed to have, some tie to an arcane lineage, are also the only units to present a menagerie of options for their Yudimo, literally. And that could just be because that is what they kind of were derived from, right? And I mean, there are some exceptions, right? A Knight, Darlyclatter, and Dor are all classed as Arcanists, but they still appear as themselves. And I think they are a bit of a special case. The latter two, Darlyclatter and Dor, are magical constructs that have been given life, right? So their truest essence, their most primitive form really is just themselves. In terms of A Knight, well, it's just his armor. His armor isn't actually him, he's just possessing it. The character itself is still formless, so there's really no reason to see any changes there. There's nothing to see, right? Though I guess technically it's never actually been confirmed that he's formless, but the alternative is that he's invisible and he's always just buck-ass naked, save for the cape and gloves, so I guess it's up to interpretation. On top of that, there are also some non-organic Yudimo, though honestly, that's not really an issue, I don't think. I mean, we have a whole class of characters that are just regular objects that have been granted sapience, right? One of our Beyonds is a talking spaceship, and said talking spaceship mentions a planet of sapient pizza that worships humans in his anecdote, right? And that's just a whole other thing I never want to delve into, because it's a little too much even for me. And even besides that, right, there are several examples of, magical and divine constructs in our real-life mythologies. Talos, the bronze mechanical man forged by Hephaestus, Galatea, the living statue carved by Pygmalion, Medea's dragon-toothed warriors, the bulls of Colchis, golems, homunculi, gargoyles. There is definitely precedent for this sort of inorganic yet living entity existing, right? At least within mythology. So having a magical talking toaster imbuing your bloodline with Arcanum, it's really hardly the most implausible thing that could happen, right? There's definitely weirder, I think, within context. But that's basically it. All Arcanists descended either from someone who boinked a critter, or were else granted their powers via some magical sapient household appliance. You know, possibly. That's gonna be it, right? I'd like to give a special thanks to Ayn Rand, Paul Ryan for being a patron and helping to support these videos. And to everybody, thank you for watching. I hope it was at least somewhat enjoyable and not just, inept rambling for 20 plus minutes. And I will see you all on the next one, alright? Bye-bye.